Chapter 8 Audit Sampling. Selecting items for testing to gather audit evidence. When designing audit procedures, the auditor should determine appropriate means of selecting items for testing. The means available to the auditors are selecting all items or 100% examination, selecting specific items and audit sampling, selecting all items or 100% examination. Unlikely in the case of test of control, but more common to substantive procedures, may be appropriate when a population constitutes a small number of large value items, when both inherent risk and control risk are high and other means do not provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence, or when the repetitive nature of a calculation or other process performed by computer information makes 100% examination cost effective. Selecting specific items. The auditor may decide to select specific items from a population based on such factors as knowledge of the client's business, preliminary assessment of inherent and control risks, and characteristics of the population being tested. The judgmental selection of specific items is subject to non-sampling risk. Specific items selected may include high-value or key items, all items over a certain amount, items to obtain information, and items to test procedures. While an efficient means of gathering audit evidence, it does not constitute audit sampling. The result of audit procedures applied to specific items selected cannot be projected to the entire population. Audit sampling. Audit sampling involves the application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items within an account balance or class of transactions. Sampling may be statistical or non-statistical. Statistical sampling means any approach to sampling that has the following characteristics: random selection of a sample and use of probability theory to evaluate sample results. Non-statistical sampling, a sampling approach that does not have the characteristic mentioned before, the statistical sampling. Alright? Audit sampling plan refers to the procedures an auditor applies to accomplish a sampling application. It aids an auditor to informing conclusions about one or more characteristics of either a particular class of transactions or a particular account balance. Attribute sampling, applicable to test of control. Used to test an entity's rate of deviation, also called rate of occurrence, from a prescribed control procedure. Variable sampling, applicable to substantive tests, most commonly used to test whether recorded account balances are fairly stated. Sampling risk rises from the possibility that the auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from a conclusion reached if the entire population were subjected to the same audit procedures. The confidence level, also called the reliability level, is the mathematical complement of the applicable sampling risk factor. Sampling risk is to be measured and controlled. The auditor controls sampling risk by specifying the acceptable level when developing the sampling plan. For test of control, sampling risk has following aspects. Number 1, risk of assessing control risk too low or risk of over-reliance. This is the risk that the auditor will conclude that control risk is lower than it actually is. It affects audit effectiveness and more likely to lead in an inappropriate audit opinion. Risk of assessing control risk too high. The risk that the auditor will conclude the control risk is higher than it actually is. It affects audit efficiency as it would usually lead to additional work to establish that initial conclusions were incorrect. For substantive tests, sampling risk has the following aspects: risk of incorrect acceptance, the risk that the auditor will conclude that a material error does not exist when in fact it does. It affects audit effectiveness and more likely to lead to an inappropriate audit opinion. Risk of incorrect rejection, the risk that the auditor will conclude that the material error exists when in fact it does not. It affects audit efficiency as it would usually lead to additional work to establish the initial conclusions were incorrect. Non-sampling risk. Non-sampling risk arises from factors that causes the auditor to reach an erroneous conclusion for any reason not related to the size of the sample. For example, most audit evidence is persuasive rather than conclusive. The auditor might use inappropriate procedures, or auditor might misinterpret evidence and fail to recognize the error. Steps in an attribute sampling plan. Define the objectives of the plan. The auditor should clearly state what is to be accomplished. Define the population. For example, if the auditor's objective is to test controls designed to assure that all shipped goods are invoiced, the population would be defined as all shipping documents issued during the period and not all sales invoices. Step number 3, define the attribute and deviation conditions. An attribute is characteristic of control. For example, the supervisor's signature of approval on a document. A deviation is the absence of the attribute. Determine the sample size. The sample size is determined by considering the following factors: risk assessing control risk too low, tolerable deviation rate, expected population and deviation rate, risk of assessing control risk too low. There is an inverse relationship between this risk and a sample size. The higher the acceptance risk, the smaller the sample size. Because the risk of assessing control risk too low relates to the effectiveness of the audit. It is kept at a relatively low level by the auditor. Tolerable deviation rate or tolerable error. This is the maximum deviation rate that the auditor is willing to accept. The lower the rate of deviation the auditor is willing to accept, the larger the sample size needs to be. Expected population deviation rate, expected error. The rate of deviation from the prescribed control procedure the auditor expects to find in the population. The higher the rate of deviation that the auditor expects, the larger the sample size needs to be so as to be in a position to make a reasonable estimate of the actual rate of deviation. Factors relevant to the auditor's consideration of expected error include auditor's understanding of the business, in particular procedures undertaken to obtain the understanding of the accounting and internal control systems, changes in personnel or in accounting and internal control systems, the results of audit procedures applied in prior periods, and the results of other audit procedures. Determine the method of sample selection. Some commonly used methods are random number sampling. Each item in the population has an equal chance and non-zero probability of selection. It is usually accomplished by generating random numbers from a random number table or computer program and tracing them to associated documents or items in the population. It is appropriate for both statistical and non-statistical sampling. Systematic selection. The number of sampling units in the population is divided by the sample size to give a sample interval. For example, 50, and having determined the starting point within the first 50, and each 50th sampling unit is thereafter selected. Although the starting point may be determined haphazardly, the sample is more likely to be truly random if it is determined by use of computerized random number generator or random number tables. When using systematic selection, the auditor would need to determine the sampling units within the population are not structured in such a way that the sampling intervals correspond with particular pattern in the population. Block section or cluster sampling. It involves selecting a block of contagious items within the population. It cannot ordinarily be used in audit sampling because most populations are structured such that items in sequence can be expected to have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics from items elsewhere in the population. Although in some circumstances it may be appropriate audit procedure to examine a block of items, it would rarely be an appropriate sample selection technique when the auditor intends to draw valid inferences about the entire population based on the sample. Haphazard selection. The auditor selects a sample without following a structured technique. It is not appropriate when using statistical sampling. Stratification. This involves subdividing population into subpopulations or strata. a group sampling units which have similar characteristics. The strata must be explicitly defined so that each sampling unit can belong to one stratum. This method enables the auditor to direct his efforts towards the item. He considers the items he considers would potentially contain the greater monetary error. Performing the sampling plan. The sampling unit selected should be examined for the attributes of interest, and deviation should be documented in the working papers. Evaluate and document the results. This includes determining the sample deviation rate. Sample deviation rate is equals to number of deviation observed over sample size. Determining the maximum population. Deviation rate, achieve upper deviation limit, and allowance for sampling risk, achieve precision. The maximum deviation rate is based on the sample size and the number of deviations discovered. There are standard tables that yield maximum population deviation rates at specified risks of assessing control risk too low. Allowance for sampling risk is equals to maximum deviation rate minus sample deviation rate. Considering qualitative information, the auditor considers each of the deviation nature, importance, and probable cause, reaching an overall conclusion. In assessing control risk, the auditor considers all available quantitative and qualitative information. Commonly used attributes sampling techniques. Attribute estimation sampling, a statistical sampling plan for tests of controls, appropriate when auditor wishes to estimate a true but unknown population deviation rate. Uses a fixed sampling plan. The auditor tests a single sample. Sequential sampling, also called stop-or-go sampling. The sampling plan is performed in several steps. Following each step, the auditor decides whether to stop or to go on the next step. Appropriate when the auditor expects zero or few deviations. Discovery sampling. Appropriate when the expected deviation rate is near zero and when the auditor's objective is to find at least one deviation in sample of if the actual population deviation rate exceeds or equals the predetermined critical rate or tolerable deviation rate. Steps in variable sampling plan. Determine the objective of the test. The auditor's objective is to test the reasonableness of a recorded account balance, called hypothesis testing. Define the population and sampling unit. For example, the population might consist of 1,000 accounts receivable with a reported book value of 1,500,000. Choose an audit sampling technique, statistical versus non-statistical. Classical variable sampling versus probability proportional to size sampling. Determine the sample size. The auditor considers the following: variation within the population. Sample size varies in the same direction as the variation in population amount. As population variation increases, so does the sample size. An estimate of population variation is made by determining a population standard deviation, acceptable risk of incorrect rejection, acceptable risk of incorrect acceptance, tolerable error, the maximum monetary error that may exist in an account balance without using the financial statements to be materially misstated. Determining the method of sample selection. Perform the sampling plan. Evaluate the sample results. The following procedures are performed: projecting the sample error to the population, considering sample risk, considering qualitative information, and reaching an overall conclusion.